next guest believes reopening the province is premature. Raywat Deonandan is an associate professor and epidemiologist at the University of Ottawa. He joins us again on the line now. Hi, Raywat.
Hi, how are you?
Doing okay. In his announcement, Ford mentioned his confidence in the plan. What did you make of that? Why don't you think now is the time to be reopening?
There are a number of reasons. First is, if the plan was to close things down to buy us time to get more resources and deploy them well, I don't think we spent that time enough or acquired those resources that we needed. For example, we have this threat of these new variants, and that's a pretty dire threat. They're an existential threat to our healthcare system if they're allowed to run amok. And yet the screening programs for those variants are really not up and running to high efficiency yet, and the guidance is pretty unclear on how to manage outbreaks of the new variants in many places. So that's got to get cleared up. And also, we're sort of back where we were in late October in terms of the incidence rate. And that's when we closed down the first time, or at least the first time in the fall. So it's a funny place to be opening up when this threshold was a closing threshold last time around. We're sort of plateauing at a place where the healthcare system is still under stress in many parts of the province. So I don't think it's sustainable to be here. The other good reason is the schools. So I think everybody agrees that schools should be a priority. And now that they're opening up, I think we should give them some time to open up and see if, in fact, they do cause more transmission. If they don't, that's fine. But if they do, well, let's wait a couple of weeks to find out and invest some surveillance resources in schools to manage that scenario. So, and the other big reason really is the vaccine situation. So right now we don't have vaccines coming in. We anticipate having them sometime soon. But it seems a bit, shall we say, irresponsible to be courting increased transmission at a time when we haven't got the resources in terms of vaccines to harden our most vulnerable institutions.
Let's back up and talk about some of those things, because you mentioned the case count and that, you know, as you say, we're sort of where it was in late October when we were considering closing things. Is there a number that you would want to see it back at before one considered this kind of reopening plan?
Well, I mean, it's not just one number. We're looking at incidence rate, we're looking at the test positivity rate, looking at the hospital, usage statistics. So something back in early fall would be nice, or summertime. I mean, frankly, the ideal thing is to drive for something resembling COVID-0 and hold there while the vaccine does its job. That way we can have an open economy and have everything resembling normal like we have in Atlantic Canada. We're not going to do that, though. So absent that plan, aim for indicators looking the way they did in late summer, early fall. But again, I keep kind of hammering home that the new variants are the great confounder here. We don't really know much about them yet and the speed with which they may tear through our population. And it seems the responsible thing to do is to curtail transmission so that the new variants don't become the dominant variants faster than they need to, because then we're almost back to square one in some ways.
You mentioned schools, and this idea, you just said that surveillance in schools might be necessary in order to figure out how things are spreading. How would you want to see that happen?
I want to see asymptomatic surveillance across the board. For example, we're not sure if schools are in fact initiators of outbreaks, because imagine a child that becomes infected, he or she is asymptomatic, there's no reason for them to get tested, so we never find out about them. Unless they go home and infect their parent becomes symptomatic, then they get tested and we find out about the parent. And then we trace the rest of the family and find that child and assume incorrectly that child their infection was caused by the parent. So the system isn't set up to identify asymptomatic index cases. To correct that, we need ongoing asymptomatic surveillance in the form of rapid testing. Now, we have that in some schools already. It has to be deployed on a wider basis, on a regular basis across the board. That we will know for sure the role of schools, and also we'll be able to keep the schools running as smoothly as we can in the long run.
Whereas trying to do that kind of surveillance with businesses open, where the businesses, would be part of it, how complicated is that to imagine?
It's not impossible. It's just added a level of complication that we don't need right now. So give the schools a few weeks to see what happens. Now, if the businesses are open, we can't be sure that increased levels of transmission are due to schools or due to businesses or some kind of synergistic effect, which seems more likely, to be honest. So again, these decisions shouldn't be made solely by epidemiologists and public health people. Let's be clear about that. I understand there are economic considerations. There's definitely a need for public education to happen and public tolerance. So I understand different voices around the table. But from strictly a public health perspective, to me it makes sense to wait a little longer, drive the caseload further down, give us some headspace. The new variants don't give us a lot of headspace here to make errors. So it makes sense to drive the case numbers down further so we have that space to play with.
Can I ask what kind of research you've seen in the field so far on the new variants of the virus? Because, I mean, the Premier didn't go into much detail. He just said the province has a good handle on it.
Well, I don't know what he means by that. We have surveillance tools in place. In Ottawa, we're looking at using our wastewater surveillance to that end, which is fantastic. We're looking at a proportion of positive cases get to deeper genomic surveillance. We're looking at the PCR test, a proxy indicator looking at the S gene. Don't get too deep in the nerd woods there. but in terms of, what we can do about the variants, not a lot. The vaccines, some work well and some don't, depending upon which variant we're talking about. And in terms of what individuals have to do, we still got to keep our distance and wear masks. It's just that the margin for error is so much smaller now. Therefore, the threat is greater. And the more things open up, the more people are going to slip up, the less tolerance we have for sloppy mask usage or poor quality masks, for example. And of course, we got to really focus hard on aerosol transmission. I don't think that message gets across as well as it should. The fact that COVID is airborne, and we need to focus on ventilation systems, HVAC, windows, that kind of thing. That will help enormously, I think, going forward.
Raywat, thank you as always for being with us today.
Thank you.
Raywat Deonandan is Associate Professor and Epidemiologist at the University of Ottawa.